For 30 years, he called strangers at 2 in the morning to tell them they were worth it, and never once believed it about himself. Richard Simmons built an empire not on discipline or punishment, but on something far stranger: the radical belief that people deserve joy exactly as they are. 20 million videocassettes, 4 daytime Emmys, a phone that never stopped ringing, because he was always the one dialing. Then, in February 2014, a door closed in the Hollywood Hills, and it didn't open for a decade. What was he hiding from? What did Diane Sawyer find when he finally sent her flowers and 5 words, "I trust you"? And why did the man who spent 40 years rushing toward other people's pain spend his final years running from his own? To understand how it all ended, we have to go back to where it began. To a boy in New Orleans who didn't believe a single word he would one day teach the world. He was born on the 12th of July, 1948, in New Orleans, Louisiana, a city that has always understood something the rest of America struggles to articulate: that joy and sorrow are not opposites, that the loudest music often rises from the deepest grief, that the people who make a room laugh the hardest are sometimes the ones carrying the heaviest thing. Richard Simmons was a New Orleans child in every sense of that phrase. He was excessive. He was theatrical. He arrived in every space, as though the space had been waiting for him, as though the walls themselves had been holding their breath and could finally exhale. He made people feel that. He had the gift, the dangerous and exhausting gift, of making every single person in front of him feel chosen. But before the sequins, before the tank tops, and the explosion of curls, and the name that would one day appear on more than 20 million videocassette boxes, before the phone calls to strangers, and the tears on national television, and the studio in Beverly Hills where people came not just to lose weight, but to feel, for 1 hour, that they were worth the effort. Before all of that, there was a boy in Louisiana who did not believe any of those things about himself. He was heavy as a child, severely, visibly, cruelly heavy in the way that children notice and adults pretend not to. He carried 132 kilograms on a frame that had not yet learned how to carry anything at all. And the world around him, the schoolyard, the neighborhood, the ordinary brutal machinery of childhood social hierarchy, made sure he knew it. The bullying was not subtle. It was not the quiet kind that leaves no marks. It was the kind that follows a person for decades, that lives in the body long after the words have been forgotten, that rewires something fundamental about how a person looks at their own reflection. What does that do to a child? What does it build inside them, or destroy? Richard Simmons answered that question with his entire career. He answered it every time he took someone's hand and said the words he had needed someone to say to him. He answered it in the fitness studio and on the television screen and over the telephone at 2 in the morning when someone he had never met was struggling alone in the dark. He spent 40 years answering that question. He just never answered it for himself. The answer begins not in Hollywood, not in Beverly Hills, not in a television studio or a fitness class or a phone call to a stranger at midnight. It begins in Florence, Italy, in the 1960s, with a young man from Louisiana standing inside museums and churches and galleries, surrounded by beauty so ancient and so unapologetic that it refused to negotiate with insecurity. Something happened to Richard Simmons in Europe. Something cracked open. He studied there. He breathed a different kind of air. And when he came back different. Not healed, not whole, but pointed in a direction. Pointed toward the idea that a life could be built around making people feel magnificent. He arrived in Los Angeles the way ambitious young men from the American South have always arrived in Los Angeles, with more desire than plan, more personality than portfolio, more hunger than strategy. He took whatever work he could find. He moved through the city learning it the way cities must be learned. On foot, through failure, through the slow accumulation of small moments that do not announce themselves as important until years later. He worked in Italian restaurants. He placed an anonymous note on the windshield of a woman he saw crying outside a grocery store. The note said she was beautiful. She wrote him back. That exchange, that instinct to reach through the glass that separates strangers from each other, was the entire architecture of everything Richard Simmons would ever build. In 1974, he opened Slimmons. The name alone tells you something. Not a gym, not a fitness center, not a wellness studio with clean white walls and the implicit message that your body is a problem requiring a solution. Slimmons. His name folded into the purpose. His identity inseparable from the mission. The studio opened in Beverly Hills, which is a strange address for a place dedicated to telling people that worth is not conditional. Beverly Hills being, famously, a city that runs entirely on the proposition that worth is conditional, that it can be purchased or surgically achieved or starved into existence. Richard Simmons set up shop inside that contradiction. And people came. They came because something in his approach was genuinely different. He was not selling discipline. He was not selling punishment. He was not standing at the front of the room with a stopwatch and a clipboard and the cold precision of someone who had mistaken efficiency for compassion. He was dancing. He was crying with people he had known for 20 minutes. He was looking directly at the men and women who had spent years being told their bodies were the problem, looking directly at them and saying, with everything he had, "You are not the problem. You have never been the problem." Can you imagine what that felt like? After years of being told otherwise, can you imagine what it meant to walk into a room where someone actually believed that? The television found him, the way television always finds people who are too vivid for ordinary life. The Richard Simmons Show ran from 1980 to 1984. 4 years, 4 Daytime Emmy Awards, millions of viewers who turned on their sets in the morning and found something they had not expected to find at that hour. Genuine warmth, genuine absurdity, genuine belief, unironic and unashamed that the people watching from their living rooms deserved to feel good about themselves before the day had even properly begun. And then came Sweatin' to the Oldies. 1988. A video cassette. A concept so simple it should not have worked. Richard Simmons, in sequins, dancing to music from the 50s and 60s, surrounded by real people of all ages and all sizes. None of them the idealized bodies that fitness marketing had always insisted were the only bodies worth showing. More than 20 million copies. 20 million. That is not a fitness product. That is a cultural document. That is evidence of a hunger that the industry had never bothered to feed. The hunger of ordinary people to see themselves represented in the act of taking care of themselves, to see joy, not punishment, to see inclusion, not aspiration. He called people personally. This is the detail that stops everyone who hears it. Not a form letter, not a newsletter, not a social media post addressed to millions and experienced by no one. He called. He found the names of people who were struggling, people who had written to him, people who had been referred, people who somehow ended up in the orbit of his attention. And he called them. He talked. He listened. He remembered details. He followed up. Think about what that costs. Not in money, in attention, in emotional energy, In the daily choice to remain porous, to remain permeable, to refuse the insulation that fame almost always builds around a person, because fame, by its nature, trains you to protect yourself from the very people whose love created you. Richard Simmons refused that insulation for 30 years, and the refusal, it turns out, was not only generosity, it was also, in ways no one understood at the time, survival. February of 2014. No announcement, no press release, no farewell tour or final appearance or graceful exit stage left. Just silence. The kind of silence that arrives without warning and refuses to explain itself. 1 week, Richard Simmons was Richard Simmons, calling strangers, dancing on television, showing up at charity events with the full combustion of his personality burning at maximum intensity. And then the calls stopped. The appearances stopped. The door of a Spanish-style mansion in the Hollywood Hills closed, and the man inside it simply stayed. The world noticed immediately. Of course it did. And what the world did next says something uncomfortable about all of us. It did not, for the most part, ask, "Is he okay? What does he need?" How do we love someone who has spent their entire life being defined by their availability to others? How do we love them when they are no longer available? Instead, the world built theories. A podcast in 2017, enormously popular, genuinely compelling, raised worried questions about his whereabouts and framed his absence as a puzzle to be solved. Tabloid magazines constructed elaborate scenarios, and the darkest theory of all, the one that circulated with the particular persistence that only truly disturbing ideas achieve, was that Teresa Reveles, the woman who had managed his household for 35 years, was somehow controlling him, holding him, that the disappearance was not chosen, but imposed. The Los Angeles Police Department sent detectives to the house for a wellness check. Richard Simmons came to the door. He spoke to them calmly. He told them he was fine. He convinced them, and they left. But here is the question that the Diane Sawyer special forces us to sit with. The question that is far more troubling than any conspiracy theory about a housekeeper with sinister motives. What if the answer was always simpler, and the simplicity was the hardest part to accept? What if a man who had spent 40 years performing joy had simply run out of the energy to perform it anymore? Teresa Reveles. And this is the woman who knew him more intimately than perhaps anyone alive. The woman who was present in that house through every year of the silence, described what she saw with the plain language of someone who has lived too close to grief to dress it in drama. He was insecure, she told Diane Sawyer. He did not think he looked good anymore. He worried, with a specificity that breaks the heart, that people would see him in public and say, "Richard Simmons is old. Richard Simmons does not look good anymore." Read that again. Let it land. This is the man who spent his career telling people that beauty is not conditional, that worth does not expire, that the body you are living in right now, not the body you are working toward, not the future body, not the body you had 20 years ago, is the body that deserves love and movement and joy. He said those words to millions of people. He believed them, genuinely, ferociously believed them, for everyone except the one person he could not escape, the one face he saw every morning in the mirror of a mansion in Hollywood Hills. He had made Teresa promise, not just asked, made her promise, never take a photograph of him, not even inside the house, not even in private. The camera, which had once been his primary instrument of connection, the thing through which he had transmitted himself into living rooms across America for more than 2 decades, became something to be avoided entirely. as though the image itself were the enemy. And so he found other ways to move through the world. Sometimes he would go out in disguise. Teresa described driving him through the city, taking him to see new buildings, new stores, the Los Angeles that had continued changing while he had stayed still. Nobody recognized him, she said. And you can hear in that sentence both things simultaneously: the relief of it and the devastation of it. The relief of a man who desperately needed to breathe air that was not filtered through other people's expectations, and the devastation of a man who had once been impossible to miss, now deliberately making himself invisible. Sometimes the disguise was a clown costume. Sometimes he dressed as a woman. The image is simultaneously heartbreaking and, in its own strange way, deeply Richard Simmons. Because he had always understood costume, always understood the theatrical possibilities of self-presentation. But there is a difference between a costume chosen as celebration and a costume chosen as concealment. There is a difference between performing joy and hiding grief behind the mechanics of performance. His knees were failing him. This matters more than it might initially appear. For a man whose entire identity, whose entire philosophy, was expressed through the body in motion, through dance, through the exuberant physical fact of moving together, the loss of mobility was not merely a physical limitation. It was an existential one. The body that had been his instrument, his message, his gift, was betraying him. And Richard Simmons, who had always responded to pain by dancing through it, could no longer dance. He had 6 Dalmatians. They were his constant companions through those years. The warm, uncomplicated, unconditional presence that does not look at you and see what you used to be, does not compare you to an archive of past appearances, does not need you to perform anything. They needed only what he had always been best at giving, even when he could give it to no one else. He stayed in the house. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months folded into years with the slow, merciless patience that time has when a person stops marking it with purpose. And the world outside continued to theorize, to speculate, to construct its stories. Because a world that loves a performer cannot easily accept that the performance has simply ended. It needs a villain. It needs a twist. It needs something more dramatic than the truth. The truth, as Diane Sawyer would ultimately discover, was both simpler and more devastating than any theory the world had built. And it was still unfolding, still accumulating its terrible weight, right up until the final morning. He sent her flowers, not one arrangement, not a polite gesture wrapped in professional courtesy. He sent Diane Sawyer an extraordinary number of flowers, dozens of them, arriving with the extravagance that had always been his native language, each one carrying the same small card. 5 words. 5 words that contained an entire decade of silence and a decision that must have cost him everything to make. I trust you. Think about what it means for a man who had spent 10 years refusing to be seen, refusing photographs even inside his own home, refusing to let the world confirm that he was aging, refusing to let the camera that had once loved him so completely record what time had done, to reach out to one of the most respected journalists in American television and say those 3 words. Think about what it costs. Think about what it means to choose, after a decade of careful invisibility, to be witnessed. He called her on the phone, and Diane Sawyer said something in the special that stops everything when you hear it. It was the old Richard. The old Richard. That voice, the warmth, the humor, the impossible sincerity that had once traveled through telephone wires into the homes and hearts of millions, it was still there. Whatever the decade of silence had taken from him, it had not taken that. He told her he was ready to come tell his story. He told her about the Broadway musical he was planning, a stage production of his own life, full circle, New Orleans boy becoming New Orleans legend, and his instruction for the theater, his specific, characteristic, heartbreaking instruction, was to remove the seats from the front rows, so that people could come down from the audience and dance, even then, even at 75, in failing health, in the deepening shadow of everything the decade had cost him. His instinct was still to tear down the barrier between performer and audience, still to insist that no one should have to watch joy from a distance, still to say, "Come down here, come dance with me." Preparations for the interview began, and then, on the 13th of July, 2024, one day after his 76th birthday, Richard Simmons died. But what Diane Sawyer found when she finally entered that house, what his brother Lenny and his sister-in-law Kathy and Teresa Reveles and the people who had loved him most carefully through those years allowed her to see, was not what the tabloids had constructed. It was not a prisoner. It was not a hostage. It was not a man being controlled by the sinister designs of someone else. It was something far more human and far harder to resolve. It was a man who had been brought low by the cruelest possible opponent, himself. Teresa Reveles sat across from Diane Sawyer and found her words with the careful honesty of someone who had kept a promise for a decade and was now trying to honor both the promise and the truth simultaneously. He was insecure, she said, that he don't look good anymore. And she described his specific fear, not an abstract anxiety, but a precise, articulated dread that someone would see him in public and say exactly that. Richard Simmons is old. Richard Simmons doesn't look good anymore. Can you feel the weight of that? Can you feel how particular it is? How it is not vanity, not narcissism, but something far more wounded than either of those words can hold? This was a man who had staked his entire identity, his entire purpose, his entire reason for existing in public, on the proposition that bodies are worthy of love regardless of what they look like. He had said it 10,000 times. He had wept saying it. He had held people's hands saying it. He had called strangers at midnight saying it. And he could not say it to himself. The camera, which he had once used as an instrument of radical inclusion, pointing it at bodies that the fitness industry had always hidden, insisting that everyone deserved to be seen, became the thing he feared most. Teresa had promised. No photographs, not even inside the house, not even in the privacy of the rooms where no one would see, as though the image itself, even unshared, even unobserved, would confirm something he could not bear to confirm. Sawyer revealed something else, something that recalibrates everything. He was afraid to go to the hospital. In those final hours, after the fall, after the injuries that the autopsy would later describe, through the blunt clinical language of significant bruising across his body, he was afraid. Not of death, perhaps, not of pain, which Teresa said he never complained about regardless of its source, but of being seen, of arriving at a hospital as Richard Simmons and having the world know that Richard Simmons had fallen, that Richard Simmons needed help, that the man who had spent his life rushing toward other people's vulnerability was now inside his own. Lenny and Kathy had spoken to him on the phone. He sounded a little off, they said. The phrase carries so much in so few words. A little off, which is the way people describe someone they love when they do not yet know that the conversation they are having is the last one. Teresa found him on the floor. He had been there for hours, immobile, injured, alone in the house that had been his refuge and his prison simultaneously. The house where the 6 Dalmatians kept him company, where he had watched the world continue without him from behind windows, where he had occasionally ventured out in disguise to see the new buildings and the new stores, where he had spent 10 years protecting himself from the very thing that might have saved him. Diane Sawyer said it plainly, because plainness was the only register equal to the fact. If he had not been afraid to go to the hospital, things might have been different. He was buried in his classic workout clothes, the sequined tank top, the shorts, the outfit that had been his armor and his identity and his gift to the world. The visual shorthand for everything he believed about joy and movement and the radical act of showing up. In death, as in life, he wore the uniform of his purpose. A celebration of life was held at a Catholic church in New Orleans in October of 2024. The city that made him, the city that understood, better than anywhere else, that the loudest music rises from the deepest grief. The mansion in Hollywood Hills, the house where he had lived his decade of silence, where the door had stayed closed against all of it, was listed for sale at $5.79 million. An address, a number. A house that held 10 years of a story the world is only now beginning to understand. There is a particular kind of tragedy that has no villain, no conspiracy, no betrayal, no moment where a single wrong decision changed the trajectory of everything. Just the slow, quiet accumulation of a wound that never healed, carried for decades inside the brightest, loudest, most extravagantly generous persona American popular culture had produced in a generation. Richard Simmons came into the world in New Orleans on the 12th of July, 1948. He left it in Hollywood Hills on the 13th of July, 2024. One day after his 76th birthday, as though even the timing was trying to tell us something. As though a life that had always been slightly, gloriously, heartbreakingly excessive could not resist one final gesture of excess. One final refusal to go quietly on the expected day. He spent 40 years telling the world it was beautiful exactly as it was. He never believed it about himself, and the world never knew until it was too late to tell him otherwise. That is the sentence. That is the whole story compressed to its irreducible core. And now that Diane Sawyer has given us the full picture, now that Teresa Reveles has honored him by telling the truth, now that the flowers and the note and the planned Broadway musical and the front seats removed so that people could come down and dance have all been placed in their proper context, we are left with something that demands more than grief. It demands a question. How many people are doing exactly what Richard Simmons did? How many people are pouring themselves out for everyone around them, calling, dancing, showing up, giving the speech they themselves most need to hear, while quietly, privately, steadfastly refusing to direct any of it inward? Think about what he built. Not the empire. The empire was extraordinary. But empires are built on strategy and timing and favorable conditions. Think about what he built in people. The person who played Sweatin' to the Oldies in a living room in 1989 and felt, for the first time, that movement could be joyful rather than punitive. The stranger whose windshield carried a note that said she was beautiful. The person who answered the phone at 2 in the morning and heard a voice that somehow already knew their name. He built that, deliberately, consistently, at enormous personal cost. And he was buried in his workout clothes, the sequined tank top, the shorts, the uniform of everything he believed. Because that is who he was, all the way down, all the way to the end. Not a pose, not a brand, a person. A deeply, irreparably human person who happened to have the rarest of gifts, and the most common of wounds simultaneously. The mansion in Hollywood Hills is for sale now. $5.79 million for the rooms where the 6 Dalmatians kept him company, where the disguises hung by the door, where the decade of silence accumulated its weight in the absence of photographs, and the presence of a loyalty so profound that Teresa Reveles kept her promise. Every single day, for every single year, because he asked her to. Today, the special is streaming. Today, the world gets to sit with the truth. And the truth is not dark. That is the thing. The final, essential Richard Simmons thing. The truth is not a cautionary tale about fame or isolation, or the gap between what we preach and what we practice. The truth is a love story. A complicated, imperfect, enormous love story about a man from Louisiana who decided, very early and very deliberately, that other people's joy was worth his entire life. He gave it, every day, for 40 years, without reservation. And somewhere, in the person who still plays that video cassette, in the stranger who kept a phone message from him, in the woman who received a note on her windshield and wrote him back, he is still giving it. That is his answer to the question he never answered for himself. You are worth it. You have always been worth it. Do you believe that? Do you carry someone in your life who gives everything to others and nothing to themselves? Someone who needs to hear those words as badly as Richard Simmons did? Tell us in the comments. Because if this story teaches us anything, it is that the people most fluent in the language of love are sometimes the ones most desperate to receive it. And if this is the kind of story that matters to you, the untold truths, the hidden costs, the real human beings behind the legends, then you already know what to do. Subscribe. Stay close, because the next story is waiting, and it will not disappoint.